Something has been buried beneath Blind Frog Ranch for longer than recorded history, and Duane Ollinger just found it. After years of failed excavations, destroyed equipment, and a financial toll that would have broken any other man, the ground has finally given up a secret that nobody was prepared for. What lies underneath this Utah property has shaken the crew, silenced the experts, and raised a question that nobody in science is ready to answer. Subscribe and stay until the end, because this one changes everything. Duane Ollinger did not stumble onto Blind Frog Ranch by accident. He came looking for something, armed with old maps, geological surveys, and a conviction that the Uinta Basin in northeastern Utah was hiding something of enormous value beneath its surface. What he could not have known when he first set foot on that property was that the land itself would spend the next several years fighting him at every turn. Equipment that worked perfectly on other job sites began malfunctioning within hours of arriving on the ranch. Drilling rigs seized up without mechanical explanation. Sensors produced readings that veteran operators had never encountered in decades of fieldwork. The ground swallowed tools, collapsed excavation walls, and flooded passages the moment the crew got close to anything significant. Most men would have read those signs and walked away. Duane Ollinger treated them as confirmation that he was looking in exactly the right place. The financial cost of that stubbornness has been staggering. Season after season, the Ollinger operation has poured resources into a property that has returned mystery in place of answers and resistance in place of reward. Investors grew impatient. Experts raised their eyebrows. The wider world watched with a mixture of fascination and skepticism as one determined man refused to accept that the ranch had beaten him. There were moments that kept him going. Strange metallic objects pulled from the sediment, passages that opened into underground water systems far too vast to be naturally occurring, readings from deep sonar equipment that suggested large structured voids existed far beneath the surface. None of it was enough to close the case, but all of it was enough to keep Duane drilling. The history of Blind Frog Ranch is not a history of failure. It is a history of a man systematically eliminating every wrong answer until only one remained. What was recently uncovered beneath that property is the direct result of years of punishment, persistence, and an absolute refusal to quit. That context matters, because what was found underground at Blind Frog Ranch is not the kind of discovery that happens quickly. It is the kind that only comes to the man who was still standing after everyone else had gone home. Long before Duane Ollinger ever broke ground on Blind Frog Ranch, the data was already telling a strange story. Geological surveys of the Uinta Basin have historically produced results that left researchers with more questions than answers. The region sits atop an unusual formation of sedimentary and igneous rock layers that do not behave the way comparable formations do elsewhere in the American West. Water tables in the area move in patterns that contradict standard hydrological models. Magnetic field readings fluctuate in localized zones across the basin without any surface feature to explain the variation. For most of the scientific community, these anomalies were cataloged and set aside as geological curiosities. For anyone paying close attention, they were a map. The specific parcel of land that became Blind Frog Ranch sits over one of the most geologically unusual sections of the entire basin. Early sonar work conducted on the property returned images of what appeared to be large subterranean voids arranged in a pattern inconsistent with natural cave formation. Natural caves follow the path of least resistance through soluble rock, carving irregular channels shaped entirely by water and time. What the sonar revealed beneath Blind Frog Ranch did not follow that pattern. The voids appeared too uniform, too deliberate in their arrangement, and in several cases too deep to have been formed by the water sources currently present on the surface. Electromagnetic readings taken at multiple points across the property showed concentrated anomalies directly above these underground formations, suggesting that whatever existed beneath the surface was interacting with the electromagnetic environment above it in real time. The crew recorded equipment malfunctions, compass deviations, and electronic interference that correlated directly with proximity to these zones. Animals on the property avoided specific areas entirely, refusing to graze or even cross certain sections of the land regardless of what was planted there. Taken individually, each of these data points has a conventional explanation. Taken together and mapped against the underground formations the sonar had identified, they formed a picture of a subterranean environment that was active, structured, and unlike anything in the geological literature for this region, that picture is what drew Duane Ollinger deeper, and deeper is exactly where the answers were waiting. The excavation history of Blind Frog Ranch reads like a record of near misses, each one more significant than the last. In the earliest phases of the investigation, the crew focused on surface-level anomalies, sinkholes that appeared without seismic activity, discolored soil patches that suggested buried metallic material below, and shoreline formations along the ranch's water features that looked as though they had been shaped rather than naturally deposited. What they pulled from those early digs was already remarkable. Fragments of metal alloy that did not match any ore body known to exist in that part of Utah. Carved stone pieces bearing markings that regional archaeologists could not immediately classify. Traces of what appeared to be refined material, processed, not raw, at depths that should have predated any human activity capable of that kind of metallurgy. Each find pointed downward. Every artifact suggested that the significant material was not on the surface or near it, but buried far beneath in conditions that had preserved it for an extraordinary length of time. The crew pushed deeper in subsequent seasons, deploying more sophisticated drilling equipment and bringing in consultants with backgrounds in mining, archaeology, and structural geology. What they encountered as they descended was a submerged cave network of a scale that had not shown up clearly in the original surveys. Water-filled passages stretched laterally beneath the property in multiple directions, some connecting to underground reservoirs that appeared to be fed by sources with no clear surface origin. Divers who entered the accessible portions of these passages reported formations along the walls and ceilings that did not resemble standard limestone cave features. The geometry was too consistent, the surfaces in certain sections were too smooth, and in at least one documented instance, the passage appeared to widen into a chamber of significant size before the visibility conditions forced the team to surface. That chamber is what the subsequent excavations were trying to reach. The flooded conditions, the depth, and the geological instability of the surrounding formation made direct access impossible with the equipment available at the time. Every season brought the crew closer to a viable entry point, and every season the ranch found a new way to deny it, until now. Every previous attempt to reach the chamber beneath Blind Frog Ranch had been stopped by the same combination of factors: water intrusion, structural instability in the surrounding rock, and the sheer depth of the target formation relative to the drilling capacity of the equipment being used. What changed heading into the most recent excavation was not luck, it was method. After consulting with a structural geologist who had worked on deep extraction projects in similarly unstable sedimentary environments, the Ollinger team made a fundamental shift in their approach. Instead of drilling straight down toward the chamber from above, they identified a lateral entry point on the western edge of the property where the underground water table was significantly lower and the rock composition offered more stable conditions for a sustained dig. That single decision changed everything. The new entry angle allowed the crew to work at depth without immediately hitting the flooded passages that had terminated earlier attempts. Progress was slow and required constant monitoring of the surrounding formation for signs of shifting, but for the first time in the history of the operation, the ground was not actively collapsing the work behind them as they advanced. New ground-penetrating radar equipment brought onto the property for this phase returned images of the target chamber with a resolution that previous surveys had never achieved. What those images showed was not a single void, but a connected series of spaces, the largest of which registered at dimensions that made the entire crew go quiet when the data came back. The atmosphere during the descent phase of this excavation was described by those present as unlike anything they had experienced on the ranch before. The equipment was performing, the formation was holding, and the readings coming off the instruments as they pushed deeper were telling a story that nobody on that crew had a ready explanation for. Electromagnetic fluctuations that had plagued the ranch for years intensified sharply at a specific depth, concentrating directly along the path the new entry angle was following. Rather than treating this as interference to work around, the team began using it as a signal, a marker that they were moving in exactly the right direction. The deeper they went, the stronger it got. And then, at a depth that exceeded every prior excavation on the property by a significant margin, the drill broke through into open space. The chamber was real. It was exactly where the data said it would be, and what the crew found inside it was not what anyone had prepared for. The moment the drilling equipment broke through into the chamber beneath Blind Frog Ranch, the atmosphere on site changed in a way that everyone present would later struggle to describe accurately. The first indication that something extraordinary had been reached was not visual, it was the instruments. Every piece of electronic monitoring equipment running at the time registered a simultaneous spike across multiple measurement categories. Electromagnetic readings surged. Temperature sensors inside the bore detected a thermal environment inconsistent with the surrounding geology, and the acoustic sensors, which had been running continuously to monitor structural stability, picked up a low-frequency resonance emanating from within the chamber that had no identifiable mechanical source. When the crew achieved physical access to the interior, what they found defied every geological model that had been applied to the property over years of investigation. The chamber walls were not raw rock. Sections of the interior surface showed evidence of treatment, a smoothing and apparent reinforcement that could not be attributed to natural erosion or water action. The geometry of the space itself was the most immediately striking element. Natural cave chambers form in response to the irregular dissolution of soluble rock, producing asymmetrical, organically shaped voids. What the team entered was not that. The proportions were consistent in a way that natural formation simply does not produce. The ceiling height remained stable across the primary section of the chamber. The floor, while partially covered in sediment accumulated over an indeterminate period of time, showed evidence of an underlying surface that was level in a manner the surrounding geology offered no explanation for. Embedded in the sediment layer and partially exposed along one of the treated wall sections, the crew located objects that immediately halted all further excavation activity. The materials recovered from the chamber floor included metallic pieces of a composition that field analysis could not match to any ore body in the regional geological record, consistent with the anomalous fragments recovered in earlier surface-level digs, but far larger and in significantly better condition. Along the wall, partially obscured by mineral deposit buildup accumulated over what geologists on-site estimated to be an extraordinary span of time, a series of deliberate markings covered a continuous section of the treated surface. They were not random. They were not the product of natural mineral crystallization or erosion patterning. They were arranged with a consistency and apparent intentionality that left no member of the team with a conventional explanation to offer. The crew documented everything in place before removing anything from the chamber. The silence during that documentation process, according to those present, was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of people who understood, without yet being able to articulate it, that they were standing somewhere that fundamentally should not exist. When the materials and documentation recovered from the chamber beneath Blind Frog Ranch were presented to outside analysts, the initial responses followed a predictable pattern. Geologists offered explanations rooted in unusual but not unprecedented natural formation processes. Archaeologists suggested that the markings on the wall could represent the work of early indigenous populations with more sophisticated capability than the historical record currently credits them with. Materials analysts proposed that the metallic objects might be the product of a natural alloying process driven by specific combinations of heat, pressure, and mineral composition over geological timescales. Each of these explanations has a legitimate scientific basis, and each of them, when applied to the full body of evidence recovered from the chamber, falls apart at a specific point. The natural formation argument cannot account for the geometric consistency of the chamber's proportions. Natural dissolution processes do not produce level floors and stable ceiling heights across the primary span of a void at that depth. The mathematics of how that rock formation would have dissolved under the water and pressure conditions present in that part of the basin do not produce the shape of the space the crew entered. The indigenous craftsmanship explanation for the wall markings runs into an equally specific problem: depth and access. The chamber sits at a depth that would have required excavation technology far beyond anything attributed to the pre-Columbian populations of the Uinta Basin region. The passage through which the current team entered was created with modern drilling equipment over an extended period of time. How any population without equivalent capability reached that chamber, treated those walls, and created those markings without leaving any evidence of the access route they used is a question none of the archaeologists consulted have been able to answer satisfactorily. The metallic material analysis produced perhaps the most troubling result of all. While natural alloying processes can produce unusual compositions under extreme geological conditions, the specific elemental ratios present in the recovered pieces do not correspond to any naturally occurring combination documented in the literature for this region or for comparable geological environments anywhere in the American West. The material is not impossible, it is simply unexplained. And that distinction, not impossible but unexplained, is where the scientific conversation about Blind Frog Ranch currently sits. The evidence is real. The data is documented. The chamber exists. What built it, what created the markings on its walls, and what purpose it served are questions that the current state of scientific understanding is not equipped to answer. That is not a comfortable place for the scientific community to occupy. But it is exactly where the evidence has left them. Blind Frog Ranch does not exist in isolation. To understand the full significance of what was found beneath the property, it is necessary to pull back and look at the landscape surrounding it, because the Uinta Basin in northeastern Utah is not a normal piece of American geography, and it has not been for as long as anyone has been paying attention. The basin stretches across a vast section of the Colorado Plateau, bounded by mountain ranges that have historically made it one of the more remote and understudied regions in the continental United States. That remoteness did not prevent the strangeness from being documented. It simply delayed how long it took the outside world to notice. The Ute people, whose ancestral connection to this land predates any written record, have maintained for generations that the Uinta Basin is a place of threshold, a region where the boundary between the physical world and something else is thinner than anywhere else on Earth. Their oral traditions describe the land itself as alive in a way that goes beyond metaphor, capable of responding to human presence and actively resisting certain kinds of intrusion. Those traditions have historically been treated by outside researchers as cultural mythology. The evidence accumulating across the basin over the past several decades suggests they deserve a more serious hearing. Skinwalker Ranch sits less than 15 miles from Blind Frog Ranch. The phenomenon documented at Skinwalker over decades of investigation: aerial objects performing maneuvers that violate known aerodynamic principles, animals vanishing without biological trace, electronic equipment failing in localized zones, and physical effects on human observers in specific areas of the property mirrors in striking ways the catalog of anomalies recorded at Blind Frog. Two ranches, separated by a short stretch of basin floor, producing nearly identical classes of phenomenon across independent investigations conducted by different teams with different methodologies. The probability that these are unrelated events occurring in geographic proximity by coincidence shrinks with every new data point added to either file. What the chamber discovery beneath Blind Frog Ranch introduces into this equation is a subterranean dimension that the Skinwalker investigations have gestured toward but never directly accessed. The deep sonar work conducted at Skinwalker Ranch has suggested the presence of significant underground structures beneath the mesa at the center of that property. The government-affiliated research conducted at Skinwalker under the AAWSAP program, portions of which have entered the public record through Freedom of Information disclosures, referenced underground anomalies as a component of the broader phenomenon, without elaborating on what specifically was detected. The chamber beneath Blind Frog Ranch may be the first direct physical access point to whatever network of underground structures underlies this stretch of the basin. If the formation the crew entered is connected laterally to similar structures beneath adjacent properties, and the sonar data suggests that it may be, then what Duane Ollinger found is not a feature of his ranch. It is a node in something that runs beneath the entire region. That reframing changes the nature of the discovery entirely. It shifts the question from what is under Blind Frog Ranch to what is under the Uinta Basin, and whether the phenomenon observed on the surface across this region for generations is a symptom of whatever has been operating beneath it all along. Duane Ollinger arrived at Blind Frog Ranch as a treasure hunter. That is the plainest and most accurate description of what he was when this began. He had a theory about buried gold, a geological rationale for why it might be concentrated on this particular parcel of Utah land, and a determination to extract it. The man standing at the entrance to the chamber his team just uncovered is not that person anymore. What the ranch has done to Duane Ollinger over the years of this investigation is something that does not have a clean category. It has not broken him, though it has come close. It has not made him a believer in the paranormal in any simple sense, because Duane is constitutionally resistant to explanations that cannot be tested. What it has done is systematically dismantle every framework he brought to the property and left him standing in a place where the evidence demands a new one. The discovery of the chamber has not resolved Duane's mission. It has transformed it. The question is no longer whether something of significance exists beneath the ranch. That question has been answered. The questions that remain are of a fundamentally different character. What was the chamber built for? What created the markings on its walls, and over what period of time? Whether the connected voids, the ground-penetrating radar identified beyond the primary chamber contain additional materials or evidence, and perhaps most pressingly, whether accessing those deeper sections is physically possible without triggering the kind of catastrophic structural event that has terminated previous excavations. The financial reality of going further is not simple. The operation has consumed substantial resources to reach this point, and the next phase, mapping the connected chamber network, stabilizing the entry passage for extended access, and bringing in the specialist analysts that the recovered materials now demand, will require an investment that exceeds what has already been spent. Duane has made clear that this is not a point at which he is willing to stop. The argument for continuing is no longer speculative. There is a chamber beneath the property. There are markings on its walls. There are materials on its floor that do not belong to any known geological context for the region. The case for further investigation does not need to be made on the basis of theory anymore. It can be made on the basis of what has already been physically documented. What Duane plans to do next is methodical in a way that his earlier approach, driven by the urgency of financial pressure and the frustration of repeated setbacks, sometimes was not. The chamber will be fully mapped before anything further is removed. The connected passages identified in the radar data will be assessed for structural viability before any attempt is made to access them, and the materials and documentation already recovered will be submitted to a wider body of analysts than has previously been involved in the Blind Frog Ranch investigation. The treasure Duane Ollinger originally came looking for may still be down there, but it is no longer the thing he is most interested in finding. If the chamber beneath Blind Frog Ranch is constructed, something built it. That statement is simple. Its implications are not. The depth alone eliminates every conventional human population from the list of candidates. The geometric consistency of the space, the treated walls, the deliberate markings, none of it fits the archaeological record for this region at any point in the human timeline, which means the timeline is wrong or the builders have never appeared in it. The aerial phenomenon documented above this basin for generations looks entirely different when a constructed underground environment exists beneath the same ground. Objects that don't depart, they disappear. Transitions, not departures. Duane Ollinger came to this ranch looking for gold. He found a chamber that should not exist, containing materials nobody can identify, covered in markings nobody can read. The Uinta Basin has been strange for as long as anyone has lived here. Whatever is operating beneath it has apparently been doing so far longer. Duane just found the door.
Something happened under Blind Frog Ranch that the crew tried to keep quiet until now. Moments ago, Duane Ollinger finally confirmed the truth about the breathing sound the team captured deep beneath the property. This wasn't an animal, it wasn't an echo, and it wasn't a malfunction. Duane says it was deliberate, rhythmic, and coming from somewhere in the cavern system where no living thing should be. The crew froze when they heard it. Cameras picked it up, and what they found afterward proves something alive is moving under the ranch, and it's getting closer. Before we break down exactly what Duane revealed, why the team panicked, and what this discovery means, make sure to subscribe, because what you're about to hear changes everything at Blind Frog Ranch. It started on a calm evening, one of those rare nights at Blind Frog Ranch when the air felt still, and the crew finally believed things might go according to plan. Duane and Chad had been running routine checks near the primary cavern entrance, focusing on the expanding shaft system that had recently shown signs of new instability. Nothing unusual appeared on the monitors, no electromagnetic spikes, no subterranean shifts, just the constant drip of groundwater echoing below. But that quiet didn't last. At 9:17 p.m., sound tech Marlon noticed a strange fluctuation on his audio feed, an unnatural dip in the background noise, like the environment itself had suddenly taken a breath. He adjusted the gain, thinking it was interference. Instead, the waveform sharpened, and then he heard it clearly through his headset. A slow, heavy exhale rising out of the darkness beneath them. He replayed it twice to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The pattern was unmistakable. Something down there was drawing air into massive lungs and releasing it with a weight that sent a faint vibration through the headphones. It wasn't wind, it wasn't airflow shifting through the tunnels. It had rhythm, timing, volume. It sounded alive, Marlin called Duane over immediately. As soon as Duane crouched beside the equipment and put on the headset, his expression shifted. His eyebrows dropped, his posture stiffened. He lowered the headset and asked if anyone else was in the lower shaft. Chad confirmed the area was empty. No crew, no machinery running, no airflow systems active. That's when the second breath came through. Longer, deeper, so heavy it rattled the metal casing of the audio rig. Everyone nearby heard it without headphones this time. A deep, resonant "whoo" that rolled up the shaft and spilled into the open air. The sound froze the entire team. Chad stepped back instinctively. A cameraman whispered, "Is something alive down there?" Another crew member immediately reached for the drone controls, desperate to get eyes into the black void. Duane didn't move. His eyes were locked on that opening in the earth, like he was staring into the throat of something vast. "It's close," he muttered, barely above a whisper. Because the breathing wasn't coming from deep within the cavern, it was rising from a point just out of sight, inches beyond the drop-off, as if something massive was standing directly beneath them, waiting to be noticed. The moment that second breath rolled up out of the shaft, Chad Ollinger reacted before anyone else. He took 2 steps back, eyes locked on the dark opening, his flashlight trembling just slightly in his hand. Chad is usually the steady one, the voice of reason when the ranch does its worst, but this sound hit him differently. It wasn't just the volume, it wasn't even the depth, it was the intent behind it, like whatever was below them was aware of their presence and exhaling directly toward them. Chad raised his radio and called for all crew to freeze positions, but the radio crackled, distorted, and then went dead. No connection. The timing was too perfect. Comms failing exactly as the breathing intensified sent a wave of unease through everyone. One cameraman whispered, "Something's interfering with us," and glanced nervously at the sky, expecting electromagnetic distortion. But the drone feed was working fine. Only the radios were compromised. Then came the third breath. This one wasn't loud. It was closer, a slow, drawn-in inhale that vibrated the loose gravel at the lip of the shaft. Chad turned his head sharply, scanning the perimeter. "Is something crawling up?" he whispered to Duane. But Duane didn't answer. He was staring into the black void, shoulders tense, as if bracing for something none of them were prepared to see. A crew member swept his thermal camera over the shaft entrance. Nothing. No heat signatures, no movement, just a cold, dead gap. Another checked the air pressure monitor. No spikes, no changes. Everything pointed to a normal environment, except the fact that something down there was breathing like it had lungs the size of a bear. Chad crouched beside the edge, shining his light downward. The beam seemed to vanish into darkness much sooner than it should have, as if the air itself swallowed the light. "That's not normal," he said, his voice cracked. Chad doesn't scare easily, but the realization that something invisible, possibly intelligent, was only a few feet away made his nerves spark with adrenaline. Then something happened that made several crew members step back at once. The fourth breath wasn't like the others. It came with a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a vibration layered beneath the exhale, like a low-frequency growl or a vocalization masked under the airflow. It was subtle, but it was unmistakably directed. It felt like it was aimed at Chad specifically, responding to his proximity. Chad jerked upright. "It's not just breathing," he said, stepping backward. "It's aware we're here." That sentence changed the energy instantly. The entire crew shifted from curious investigators to people realizing they might be standing above something that didn't just exist beneath the ranch, but interacted with whoever got close. Duane put a hand on Chad's shoulder, pulling him back from the edge. "We're dealing with something alive," he said quietly, "and it knows we found it." While the crew scrambled to steady themselves, audio engineer Marlin was already pulling the raw recording into his laptop. His hands moved fast, but his face showed the kind of confusion that only happens when training runs headfirst into something that shouldn't exist. He isolated the waveform, those long, dragging breaths, and zoomed in. What he saw made him sit back in his chair. Human breathing follows a recognizable pattern: a rise, a plateau, and a fall. Animals have their own signatures depending on lung capacity, nasal passages, and body mass. But the waveform on Marlin's screen didn't match either. The inhale wasn't smooth. It was perfectly uniform, like air being pulled in through a single massive cavity rather than lungs. And the exhale? It had a resonance spike that shouldn't exist unless the sound was traveling through a body cavity far larger than anything native to Utah. "This isn't a person," Marlin said quietly, "but it's not an animal either." He played the audio again, this time slowing it to half speed. The breath deepened into a monstrous, cavernous tone, so wide and heavy that it made the inside of the tent vibrate. But beneath the exhale, hidden under the natural frequencies, was something that froze him completely. A rhythmic pulsing, not a heartbeat, something stranger. A bass-like flutter at perfect intervals, as if the breathing creature had multiple resonant chambers inside its body. Chad leaned over his shoulder. Could it be airflow through the tunnels? Marlin shook his head. Airflow is chaotic. This is controlled, deliberate. He ran a spectral analysis next. If the sound had been an echo, wind, or vibration, it would show scattered data across the spectrum. Instead, the breathing displayed a narrow, exact frequency range, almost like a voice. Not speech, but the foundation of speech. A kind of pre-vocalization, as if whatever made the sound had the physical ability to mimic communication, but wasn't using it yet. Then came the moment that made Marlin's stomach drop. He compared the waveform to known wildlife: bears, cougars, elk, even bison. Nothing came close. But when he overlaid it onto the harmonic signature of a human breath scaled up 4 or 5 times, the match was unnervingly close. The creature wasn't an animal. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a geological anomaly. It was something with a respiratory system similar to a human, but on a scale that shouldn't exist beneath Blind Frog Ranch. Marlin looked up at Duane, pale and visibly shaken. "Whatever's down there," he said quietly, "it's big, and it's built like us." The analysis was enough to rattle the entire crew, but no one felt the weight of it more than Duane Ollinger. Blind Frog Ranch wasn't just a project to him, this was his land, his responsibility, and whatever was breathing under it had now crossed the line from mystery to threat. So when the discussion turned to sending someone down the shaft to confirm the source, Duane didn't hesitate. He clipped into the harness before anyone could argue. Chad protested immediately. "Dad, we don't know what's down there." Duane tightened the straps anyway. "That's exactly why I'm going." The descent was slow, controlled, and eerily silent. As the team lowered him deeper into the shaft, the air temperature dropped noticeably. Duane's headlamp illuminated the walls, slick with moisture, coated in clay, and scarred with fresh gouges he didn't remember seeing before. Long, smooth indentations traced the rock as if something enormous had dragged itself through recently. Halfway down, the rope trembled in the crew's hands. Not from Duane, from below. "Stop lowering!" Chad yelled. The breathing rose again, this time so loud that Duane felt it reverberate through his chest. The exhale rolled past him like a warm, stagnant wind, carrying the unmistakable sense of proximity. Whatever was down there, it was close enough to reach out if it wanted to. Duane steadied himself, shining his light directly into the dark. The beam caught nothing at first, just endless black. Then, for a split second, the light caught movement, not a shape, not an animal. A shift, like a mass pulling itself backward into a deeper chamber. "Pull me up," Duane whispered into the radio. His voice was tight, controlled, not afraid, but aware. When he reached the surface, he didn't say a word for several minutes. Finally, he removed his harness, looked at the crew, and said, "There's something alive down there, and it's watching us." After Duane's ascent, the crew gathered around the shaft in tense silence. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but every person standing there felt the same thing, that whatever was beneath them wasn't just breathing, it was moving. And it wasn't moving randomly, it was moving with purpose. To regain some sense of control, Chad suggested they inspect the lower entrance to the cavern system, a narrow, muddy channel where groundwater seeped out after storms. If something large had recently shifted within the tunnels, it might have left physical traces there. They didn't have to search long. Just 30 yards from the main dig site, the mud told a story no one wanted to read. Sediment that had been undisturbed for years was now churned, smeared, and split open in deep grooves. The muddy banks were pushed outward, as if something massive had pressed against them while squeezing moving through the passage. Charlie crouched down for a closer look. "These aren't animal tracks," he said quietly. "Animals don't leave impressions like this." He pointed to a smooth, curved indentation, nearly 3 feet long, that tapered at one end. It looked like the imprint of a limb, but not one belonging to any creature known to Utah. The mud showed upward drag, meaning whatever made the mark had pulled itself out of the tunnel rather than stepped into it. Then they saw the water. The normally still pool outside the cavern mouth was gently rippling, not from wind, not from runoff, but from something disturbing the water from inside the tunnel. Small waves pulsed outward at perfectly timed intervals, the exact rhythm of the breathing they'd recorded earlier. Chad's jaw tightened. "It's moving around down there!" Charlie dipped a thermal probe into the water. The display flashed an irregular, fluctuating heat signature, not warm enough to be machinery, not cold enough to be natural subterranean water. Something about the temperature reading suggested mass, shifting, retreating. Duane stared at the disturbed mud in dead silence. It wasn't just the size of the tracks that bothered him. It was the direction. Every deep groove, every smear, every drag mark led toward the main shaft, straight toward the place where Duane had descended earlier, as if the creature had been moving in his direction, right before the crew heard it breathing. Duane finally spoke, voice low and steady. "It's not trapped down there, it's moving freely," and that meant one terrifying possibility. It could choose when to come up. With the mud tracks confirming movement inside the tunnels, the team shifted focus to gathering thermal data. Anything that could give a clearer picture of what exactly was navigating beneath the ranch. Charlie Snyder, the crew's most experienced tech operator, retrieved the long-range thermal imager and positioned himself directly above the cavern mouth. Charlie was calm, methodical, and rarely rattled. But the moment the device powered on, his face changed. At first, the screen displayed the expected blues and purples of cold rock and water. Everything appeared normal, quiet, still, empty. But as Charlie adjusted the sensitivity and increased the exposure, a shape flickered at the bottom of the display. He leaned closer, thinking it was a glitch. Then it appeared again, clearer this time. A heat mass, large and elongated, resting against the cavern wall. Charlie froze. It wasn't a defined shape, no obvious head, limbs, or body outline. Instead, it resembled a long, coiled form, pulsing with internal warmth. The creature, or whatever it was, seemed to have multiple hotspots distributed along its length, like several warm chambers connected to a single body. No animal in the region had a thermal signature even remotely similar. Charlie whispered, "This thing's alive, and it's huge!" Before anyone could react, the mass shifted, slowly, deliberately. The hotspot elongated and then contracted, as if the creature were expanding its body to inhale and releasing after. The thermal signature breathed, but the most chilling part came next. The creature moved laterally along the cavern wall, without lifting off the surface. The heat signature slid across the rock as if the creature had the ability to adhere to it, clinging like a massive biological shadow. Charlie backed away from the monitor. "It's climbing," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. As the mass approached the vertical shaft that led upward toward the crew's position, the thermal display flickered, then went black. Not because the device lost power, because something hot, something alive, had moved directly beneath the sensor, overwhelming it. Charlie stepped back, pale. "It's not just moving," he whispered. "It's coming up." The moment the thermal scan went dark, a heavy silence fell over the crew. No one spoke, no one moved. They all stood around the cavern entrance like people waiting for something to emerge. Then, without warning, the breathing returned, louder than before, deeper, and unmistakably closer. It didn't echo this time, it resonated. The exhale rolled up through the ground beneath their feet, vibrating the loose stones and rattling the metal survey equipment. Duane snapped his head toward the shaft, eyes wide. Chad reached instinctively for his father, pulling him back from the edge. Even Even Charlie, normally unshakable, took several steps away from the cavern mouth. A fifth breath followed, slow, dragging, almost wet. This time, the sound didn't come from deep below. It came from the mid-level chamber, a space far too narrow for anything of that size to fit through, unless the creature could compress itself, flattening its body like an enormous living ribbon. "It's climbing," Charlie said quietly. But the real terror was in what came next. The breathing shifted direction. Instead of rising vertically from inside the shaft, the exhale now emerged from the side wall, through fissures and cracks, where sound should never travel. It didn't just sound close. It sounded like it was moving laterally through the rock, following them, tracking them from inside the earth. The crew backed away in unison. Then something new happened. A second breath, higher pitched, faster, almost overlapping the first. "Is that two?" Chad whispered, voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath the shaft trembled, not violently but rhythmically. A deep pulsing thump that synced with the breathing, like the creature was anchoring itself or pushing upward against the rock. Duane's expression hardened. He had seen enough. "Everyone back to the vehicle, now!" As they retreated, the final sound chased them through the darkness. A long, drawn-in inhale that seemed to stretch across the entire cavern system. It wasn't random. It wasn't instinctive. It felt purposeful, like the creature was smelling for them, memorizing them, choosing which one it wanted to follow. The crew didn't run at first. They moved quickly, but cautiously, eyes locked on the shaft as they backed away. But as soon as they reached the first equipment trailer, the ground beneath Blind Frog Ranch gave a low, rolling shudder. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't collapsing rock. It was rhythmic, almost like the cavern itself was reacting to their movement. Charlie spun toward the monitors. The seismograph needle wasn't spiking randomly. It was pulsing in a steady pattern, 5 seconds apart. Every pulse matched the breathing they had just heard. It was as if the creature underground wasn't just alive. It was moving against the earth, pushing its mass through the tunnels with a force powerful enough to register like heartbeat-sized tremors. Chad grabbed his camera, pointing it back toward the main shaft. A thin plume of dust drifted upward, not from wind, but from displacement. Something was shifting the interior. "It's coming closer," Chad said, barely above a whisper. The crew made the call to retreat fully to the trucks, but as they crossed the open field, the lights from the generator flickered violently. First a quick flutter, then a full blackout. All at once, the ranch was swallowed in pitch darkness. No ambient glow, no horizon light, just a suffocating black silence. Then the cavern hummed. A deep, resonant vibration rolled across the property, shaking the loose dirt and buzzing through the soles of their boots. The hum wasn't mechanical. It carried texture, almost like a low vocalization buried beneath layers of stone. A sound that didn't belong in nature. A sound that felt directed. Charlie stumbled back. "It's responding to us leaving," he said. Another tremor followed, stronger, closer. This time the hum rose in pitch, warbling like whatever was beneath them was exerting itself, pressing upward or dragging its body along the tunnel walls. Duane shouted for everyone to get inside the trucks immediately. As the doors slammed shut and engines roared to life, the final tremor hit, sharp, focused, and directly beneath the main shaft. Dust exploded upward, rocks clattered down the hillside, and for a single moment the breathing returned, not from the cavern, not from the shaft, from somewhere out in the open field behind them, as if the creature had found another way up. Back at base, Duane finally said what no one wanted to admit. The breathing wasn't an echo, a creature, or a natural phenomenon. It was intelligent, mobile, and using the tunnels to track them. Reviewing the data, he confirmed the truth. Whatever lived beneath Blind Frog Ranch wasn't alone. And it wasn't confined. "It's moving freely," Duane said quietly, "and now it knows we're here." The Blind Frog Ranch team forced open the forbidden basement hidden beneath the main cabin, an area Duane Ollinger has avoided for years. The room was sealed with reinforced beams, rusted hardware, and a layer of sediment that suggested it hadn't been touched in decades. But what they found inside shocked the entire crew and triggered the most violent reaction the ranch has ever recorded. Before we uncover the truth, make sure to subscribe, because what happened next may finally explain explain why the ranch has been hiding something underground. The basement had been sealed for so long that even longtime crew members spoke about it in lowered voices, unsure whether the rumors around it were exaggerated or dangerously accurate. What made it so unsettling wasn't just the padlocked door or the reinforced concrete around the entrance. It was the fact that Duane Ollinger himself had insisted for years that this was one spot on the ranch no one was allowed to touch. Not researchers, not camera crews, not even close friends. The unspoken rule was simple. Whatever was down there was better left alone. But everything changed after the most recent seismic event sent a deep, rolling vibration across the property. A tremor so strong it rattled the soil like something shifting beneath the ranch. Sensors pointed directly toward the sealed basement, and every reading suggested one impossible conclusion. Activity was coming from below it. The team exchanged uneasy glances as Duane approached the basement door, his flashlight beam cutting across dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The air felt heavier here, as though the atmosphere itself resisted being breathed in. When Duane unlatched the corroded metal hasp, the crew fell silent. For a moment, he hesitated, gripping the handle as if reconsidering whether opening it was a mistake. The ground beneath their feet vibrated again, a short, sharp pulse, like a muted heartbeat rising from deep underground, and that was enough. Duane pulled the door open. A dense, cold draft spilled out immediately, carrying a metallic scent mixed with damp earth. The temperature dropped nearly 10 degrees in seconds, fogging their breath. The stairs leading down vanished into darkness deeper than anything their lights could easily penetrate, and a low hum vibrated faintly from somewhere below, steady and rhythmic, like a distant engine buried in stone. The crew stared into the descent, realizing instantly that the rumors were wrong. The basement wasn't forbidden because it was dangerous. It was forbidden because something underneath it was waking up. The team descended the narrow staircase slowly, each step echoing with a hollow metallic ring that suggested the space beneath the ranch was far larger than Duane had ever implied. Dust drifted from the ceiling as their boots touched the concrete, and the faint hum they heard above had grown into a steady, rhythmic vibration that pressed gently against their chests. It didn't sound mechanical, it sounded alive. Duane swept his flashlight across the basement, revealing walls lined with aged support beams, rusted metal shelving, and collapsed equipment that looked decades old. But none of that explained the cold mist curling across the floor or the deep pulsing resonance radiating up through the cement. A row of overturned crates rested against the far wall, half buried under tarps, and the air around them seemed to shimmer faintly, as though heat or energy were leaking from beneath the floor. The hum shifted pitch only slightly, but the effect was immediate. The nearest light flickered, then dimmed to a dull glow. They had experienced power anomalies around the ranch before, but nothing like this. This felt controlled, intentional. Someone muttered that the signal was coming from beneath them, and the crew gathered around the center of the room where the cement appeared subtly raised, forming a nearly perfect rectangular outline, barely visible under years of dust. Duane crouched, running his hand across the seam, tracing the edges of what appeared to be a hidden hatch or subfloor entrance. His expression hardened. This wasn't on any map of the property, not even in the original mining records. The hum pulsed again, stronger this time, sending vibrations up their legs. A faint crack echoed from below, followed by a low exhale-like rush of air that made the hair on their arms stand straight. The ground felt warm now, almost as if something beneath the slab were stirring. The crew stepped back instinctively, realizing this wasn't just a basement. It was a barrier, one that had been sealed for a reason. Duane stood slowly, shining his light across the walls again, searching for any indication of who built this or what they intended to hide. But the room offered no answers, only the steady, rising pulse from below, growing louder with each passing second, as though whatever lay beneath the ranch had finally sensed They were here. The hum beneath the slab deepened into a resonant thrum that vibrated through their bones, and Duane motioned for the team to set up ground-penetrating equipment. They worked quickly, unspooling cables across the basement floor while the handheld sensors flickered with static interference. Not random, but patterned, almost rhythmic, as if reacting to their presence. When the scanner powered on, its display jumped heavily, the waveforms spiking in precise intervals that matched the pulses they felt under the concrete. It was the same pattern the ranch had produced during past incidents, but stronger, more organized. Whatever was below them wasn't dormant, it was active. One technician ran a thermal sweep, but the screen returned nothing but distortion. Instead of capturing heat signatures, it bent into shapes that wavered like silhouettes, shifting behind fogged glass. Another attempt produced a sudden cascade of pixelated bursts, short, vertical streaks that climbed the monitor like something trying to rise through the image itself. The crew exchanged uneasy looks. Instruments malfunctioned on the ranch all the time. But this felt different. This felt targeted. Duane knelt beside the slab again, studying the faint seam with a focused intensity. The concrete around it wasn't poured at the same time as the rest of the basement. It was slightly darker, smoother, as though installed later by someone who wanted to seal whatever lay beneath with precision. As he brushed more dust aside, his fingers caught something unexpected. Metal, a recessed handle barely visible, flush with the floor. He froze for a moment. No one had reported anything like this in the ranch's records or its numerous surveys. The hum shifted again, this time followed by a hollow knock from below. Not loud, but deliberate. 3 slow taps, spaced evenly apart, the same 3-beat pattern that had defined nearly every unexplained event on the ranch. The crew stepped back in a ripple of fear as the monitors echoed the sound a half-second later, displaying synchronized spikes that rose in perfect unison. The floor warmed beneath their feet, subtle but undeniable. The concrete seemed to breathe, expanding in soft, shallow movements, timed with the pulses coming from below. The air thickened with a metallic scent that hinted at machinery or something far older, lurking beneath the sealed entrance. Duane exhaled slowly, realizing they were no longer just observing an anomaly. They were standing on top of it. The recessed handle embedded in the slab looked old, far older than the basement around it, but the metal was clean, almost polished, as if whatever lay beneath generated enough energy to keep corrosion away. Duane crouched beside it, running a gloved finger along the seam. The concrete surrounding the panel showed faint stress lines, not from age, but from pressure pushing upward, as though something below had been testing the barrier for years. The team exchanged apprehensive glances. Nothing on Blind Frog Ranch ever stayed still for long. But this felt different. This felt intentional. They brought in a portable winch system to test the panel's resistance. The hook latched firmly into the handle, and as the device powered on, its motor strained immediately, groaning under the load. The slab didn't budge. Instead, a deep tone resonated through the room, a low, vibrating hum that grew louder with each second of force. The team stopped instantly, fearing the structure might respond violently. When the motor released tension, the hum softened, settling back into a slow, rhythmic pulse. A technician checked the readings and frowned. The sensors weren't just detecting energy, they were detecting movement beneath the slab. Slow, almost imperceptible oscillations, rising and falling, like something breathing. The thermal scanner flickered again, this time producing a distorted image, a faint, elongated shape directly under the panel, radiating a heat signature inconsistent with geological formations. The outline wasn't perfectly human, but it wasn't entirely foreign either. It looked coiled, contained, waiting. Then the concrete shifted, barely a fraction of an inch, but enough for dust to lift off the floor in a trembling ripple. The recessed handle jerked suddenly, just once, as though pulled from the other side. The crew staggered back in shock, several drawing instinctive breaths through clenched teeth. No one spoke, no one moved. The ranch had shown aggression before, but never physical interaction with a sealed structure. This was a new threshold, one the team wasn't prepared for. Duane steadied himself and signaled for another scan. The GPR sweep illuminated the slab in tight waves, mapping the space beneath. A cavity, large and rectangular, rectangular, appeared on the display. The walls of the underground chamber were unnaturally smooth, and at the center, something metallic reflected back a perfect signal. But before they could analyze it further, every monitor in the room froze. The waveforms flattened into a single sharp line. The temperature dropped by nearly 8 degrees in under 5 seconds, and then, through the sudden silence, the same 3-beat knock echoed from below, louder this time, confident and deliberate. Something under the slab wasn't just stirring, it was responding. The 3-beat knock echoed through the basement again, this time strong enough to rattle dust from the rafters. The crew froze, waiting for a 4th strike that never came. Instead, the silence thickened into something almost tangible, as though the entire ranch were listening. Duane steadied himself, exhaling slowly while the others checked their monitors, but the readings made no sense. The energy signatures weren't random. They were patterned, coherent, rising and falling with deliberate intent. The ground beneath the slab vibrated in a controlled rhythm, too precise to be seismic activity. A technician switched the spectrograph into deeper analysis, and the waveform that appeared on the screen made his jaw drop. The pulses weren't just rhythmic, they were modulated, structured, as if something beneath the basement was communicating in a frequency just low enough to slip beneath human hearing, but strong enough to shake the foundation. Another thermal sweep flickered across the slab's surface, and this time, a clearer outline formed beneath. The shape wasn't lying still, it was shifting, curling, expanding as though waking from a long, dormant state. Heat radiated outward, distorting the image in slow waves that suggested deliberate movement. The technicians whispered anxiously, but Duane leaned in closer, studying the readings with narrowed eyes. Whatever was down there wasn't inert. It was adjusting itself, reacting to their attempts to uncover it. Suddenly, the GPR scanner spiked to maximum capacity, filling the display with violent surges. A rectangular mass inside the chamber began to hum, resonating at the same frequency as the slab. The metallic object at the center, whatever it was, had activated. A sharp pop split the air, and every light in the basement snapped off. For 3 suffocating seconds, the team stood in absolute darkness. Then, the slab glowed. A thin line of pale blue light traced the seam around the panel, pulsing in sync with the underground chamber. The basement filled with a low harmonic tone that vibrated through their bones. One crew member stumbled backward, clutching his chest as the pressure intensified. Another dropped her equipment as her vision wavered with the resonance. Duane shouted for everyone to stand back, but his voice was swallowed by the rising hum. The light spread outward across the floor, following invisible pathways etched beneath the concrete. Geometric lines, perfectly symmetrical, connecting the slab to the rest of the basement like circuitry. The ranch had always responded to human activity, but this was different. This felt like activation, not reaction. The pulse beneath the slab intensified until the air itself trembled. 3 beats, a pause. 3 beats stronger than before. The pattern struck the crew like a physical force, pushing them backward as the basement filled with a pressure that made the walls groan. The metallic object below surged again, sending a final shockwave that shattered one of the monitors in a spray of sparks. And then the glowing lines winked out. The hum stopped. The basement fell silent. But the slab remained warm like something alive beneath it had finally opened its eyes. The crew worked in tense silence as the last sparks died from the damaged monitor. No one wanted to speak the obvious truth. Something beneath the basement had just initiated a response, and none of their equipment could explain how. Duane steadied his flashlight and motioned the team forward, but even he hesitated before crossing the threshold. The warmth radiating from the slab had spread through the concrete, rising in slow waves that felt unnatural for stone sealed away from sunlight. When the lights finally flickered back on, every instrument in the room flashed with scrambled data, except one. The infrasound receiver had come back online with perfect clarity, its needle twitching in a steady rhythm that mirrored the pulse beneath the slab. The crew gathered around it, watching as the frequency stabilized into a narrow band, far too controlled to be geological. Whatever was below them was emitting a signal again, stronger, clearer, almost almost as if the earlier surge had sharpened its ability to communicate. A cold draft swept across the room, despite the lack of any open vent. The air pressure shifted in a subtle but unmistakable drop, pulling a chill up their spines. The temperature sensors detected it simultaneously, falling degrees in perfect sync with the frequency bursts. One technician whispered that it felt like the ranch itself was inhaling. Another muttered that something beneath the slab was changing the air around it. Then the floor trembled. Not a violent shake, something far worse. A slow, deliberate upward push, like the earth was swelling beneath their feet. The vibration traveled through the soles of their boots, rising into their legs with an almost biological rhythm. Duane raised a hand for silence. The pulses were counting again. 3 beats, a pause. 3 beats, each stronger, deeper, more resonant. The seismic monitor lit up with a new reading, but this time the waveform wasn't random. The pattern looked engineered, curving arches, repeating nodes, intervals too precise to be natural. One of the technicians gasped. The signal resembled a blueprint, a layout, a map. The lines converged into a shape centered beneath the slab, a chamber with a secondary structure attached to it, one that hadn't shown up in any previous scans. The structure flashed in rhythmic pulses, almost like a heartbeat, feeding its signal through the basement floor. As the tremors intensified, dust drifted down from the ceiling in a thin mist, and a faint metallic scent seeped into the air, sharp, cold, and strangely clean, as though an ancient reservoir had finally been breached. A sudden clang echoed from within the slab, deep and hollow, like a metal latch shifting under immense pressure. The crew jumped back, eyes locked on the seam. The concrete around the slab darkened, soaking in moisture from within. Something behind the panel was expanding or waking. Duane called for evacuation, but before they could step back, the slab emitted a sudden, deafening snap. A hairline crack shot across its surface, glowing faintly with the same blue light as before. Everyone froze. The pulse beneath them steadied into a single continuous hum, one that felt less like a warning and more like an invitation or a countdown. The glowing crack across the slab widened in a slow, steady crawl, releasing a thin ribbon of cold air that drifted across the basement like fog. The temperature dropped instantly. Breath crystallized in front of their faces, and a low mechanical groan vibrated through the walls as if the entire ranch were shifting under their feet. Duane stepped back, shouting for everyone to stay clear, but the crew barely heard him. The hum beneath the slab had changed again. It was no longer pulsing. It was speaking. The infrasound receiver translated the vibrations into a visible waveform on the remaining monitor. The pattern repeated in perfect intervals, forming sharp peaks and descending arcs with mathematical precision. One technician whispered that it looked like a sequencing code, something engineered, intentional. Suddenly, the lights flickered out. Everything went black except for the faint blue glow leaking from the widening crack. The crew's flashlights snapped on in trembling hands, beams slicing through the cold haze swirling around their legs. A deep, resonant thud rose from below the slab, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. Another followed, closer, heavier, like something large shifting inside a confined space. The ground rippled beneath their boots, not a random tremor. A deliberate push from below. The crack split further, releasing a sharp metallic hiss as if pressure built for decades was finally escaping. A thin, unnatural wind swept upward, carrying the scent of iron and something older, like stone soaked in ancient water. Duane backed toward the stairs, his voice low and urgent. "We're done! Out! Now!" But before the team could retreat, the slab pulsed once more, bright enough to wash the entire basement in a cold, ghostly light. The vibration tightened around them, focusing on the center of the room. Every sensor spiked at once, alarms screeching in a single, unified warning. The signal coming from the chamber below was no longer dormant. It was active, and whatever had been sealed under Blind Frog Ranch was no longer contained. The team scrambled for the staircase as the basement floor vibrated beneath them in short, rapid bursts, too controlled to be seismic, too rhythmic to be natural. The crack across the slab widened again, releasing another blast of frigid air that swept upward like a breath from something buried far below. Dust lifted from the ground in spiraling threads, pulled toward the opening as if drawn by an invisible current. Duane shouted for everyone to move, his voice cutting through the alarms as tools rattled off shelves and crashed to the floor. Halfway up the stairs, the crew froze. A low, resonant tone rolled through the basement, deep enough to vibrate their chests and heavy enough to make the walls tremble. It wasn't sound, it was pressure, a force pushing outward from whatever lay beneath the slab. The blue light leaking from the crack flickered, then stabilized into a steady glow that illuminated the basement in an eerie underwater haze. One of the cameras, still miraculously recording, captured the light bending in unnatural waves, distorting the air like heat mirage, but colder, much colder. Then the vibration changed again, no longer pulses, a rising sequence, building, anticipating. The slab bowed upward in the center, stone flexing in a way stone should not be capable of. Hairline fractures spread outward like spider webs, and the hum climbed in pitch until it scraped the edge of human hearing. The crew backed up the final steps, pulling Duane with them just as the floor exhaled, an explosive burst of cold air that extinguished every light and left the entire ranch in darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, only silence. Then, movement. A soft shifting sound rose from below the slab, like something dragging across metal or stone, slow, measured. A presence, aware that the barrier containing it had weakened. The basement crack glowed once more, dim, then bright, then dim again, flashing in a deliberate sequence that mirrored the waveform on the monitors earlier. 3 pulses, a pause, 3 pulses, a message, a warning, or a response. The crew finally burst out of the basement door into the cold night air, gasping as the pressure dropped away from their skulls. But the ranch did not settle. The ground beneath the house rippled in a final wave that traveled outward across the property, sending livestock into a frenzy and triggering motion sensors from the pond to the excavation site. Whatever lived beneath Blind Frog Ranch was no longer sleeping, and the moment they opened that forbidden basement slab, it woke up.
An entire episode of Blind Frog Ranch was pulled before a single viewer could watch it. Not edited, not delayed, gone, with no explanation given and no acknowledgement it ever existed. What was filmed on that property was so far beyond what any network was willing to broadcast that the decision to bury it was made fast, and it was made final. Until now. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what surfaces in this video is the footage they spent years making sure you would never see. Blind Frog Ranch did not arrive on television the way most paranormal documentary productions do. It did not come through the standard development pipeline of a network looking for the next property-based mystery series, greenlit on the strength of a pitch deck and a promising location scout. It came through Duane Ollinger's refusal to stop making noise about what was happening on his land until someone with a camera showed up to document it. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because it established from the very beginning a fundamental tension between what Duane was willing to put on record and what the network understood itself to be producing. Duane was not interested in a television show. He was interested in evidence. The cameras were a tool for generating a documented record of what his operation was encountering beneath the surface of his property, and the broadcast audience was almost incidental to that purpose. The network, for its part, understood it was acquiring a paranormal property series in the tradition of shows that had performed well in the same cable landscape. Dramatic reveals, progressive escalation of strangeness across a season arc, a strong central personality in Duane to anchor the viewer investment. What the network did not fully account for was the possibility that the property would consistently produce phenomena that exceeded the boundaries of what that format could responsibly contain. From the earliest days of production, crew members reported experiences on the ranch that did not make it into any broadcast episode. Equipment failures so complete and so immediate that experienced operators could offer no mechanical explanation. Interference patterns in the audio recording gear that produced sounds during playback that were not audible during filming. Instances in which camera operators reported seeing things in the peripheral frame that were not visible in the footage when it was reviewed. These were not the kinds of anomalies that get flagged in a production meeting and turned into dramatic episode moments. These were the kinds of anomalies that get quietly noted, quietly set aside, and quietly excluded from the assembly cut without any formal discussion about why. The production team that spent extended periods on the ranch developed a working understanding of the property that diverged significantly from what the broadcast audience was being shown. They understood that the show was operating a significant distance from the full reality of what was being documented, and that the distance between those two things was being managed rather than bridged. That management was sustainable as long as what the cameras captured stayed within a range that editorial judgment could handle. The banned episode is what happened when the property finally produced something that editorial judgment could not handle. To understand why that episode could not be broadcast, it is necessary to first understand what the broadcast episodes were already pushing against, because the baseline of what the network allowed was already further out than most television will go, and the banned footage exists somewhere beyond that. The broadcast episodes of Blind Frog Ranch established a remarkably high threshold of documented strangeness by the standards of paranormal documentary television. Over multiple seasons, the show put on record a body of evidence that included anomalous sonar returns suggesting massive structured voids beneath the property, recovered metallic materials that field analysis could not match to any known ore deposit in the regional geological record, electromagnetic interference patterns that disabled or destroyed equipment in specific zones of the ranch, with a consistency that ruled out coincidence, and physical effects on crew members operating in certain areas of the property that required medical attention and were never satisfactorily explained by any diagnosis applied after the fact. That is what made it to broadcast. That is what the network reviewed, cleared, and transmitted to an audience of hundreds of thousands of viewers across multiple seasons of programming. By any reasonable measure, that body of evidence represents the outer boundary of what mainstream cable documentary television produces. And yet the network pulled an entire episode rather than add its contents to that record. The significance of that decision cannot be overstated. Every piece of footage that aired had already passed through the same editorial review process that evaluated the banned episode and determined it could not be shown. The people who made that determination had already cleared drone footage of unidentified aerial objects moving over the property. They had already cleared sonar imagery of underground formations with geometric properties inconsistent with natural cave development. They had already cleared segments in which crew members described physical sensations and perceptual disturbances that have no conventional medical or environmental explanation. They looked at the contents of the banned episode and concluded that it crossed a line that all of that material did not. That tells you something specific about what the banned episode contains. It is not simply more of what the broadcast episode showed. It is not a more dramatic version of the anomalies the audience had already been exposed to. Whatever was captured in that footage represents a categorical difference from the documented strangeness the network was willing to put on air. Not a quantitative escalation, but a qualitative one. The banned episode apparently documented something that could not be framed as ambiguous, could not be presented as a mystery requiring further investigation, and could not be contained within the format of a television program asking questions it does not answer. It documented something that answered a question, and the answer was not one that anyone in that building was prepared to broadcast. The production day that generated the banned episode began without any indication that it would end differently from the dozens of filming days that had preceded it on Blind Frog Ranch. The crew assembled on the property in the early morning with a defined investigation objective for the day. A targeted examination of a specific section of the underground water system that sonar work from the previous shoot had flagged as producing anomalous return signatures. The equipment load-in was standard. The camera configuration was standard. The personnel on site included the core documentary crew, several members of the Ollinger Ranch operation, and a geological consultant who had been brought in to assess the sonar data from the prior session and advise on the viability of deeper access into the flagged section of the underground network. Nobody arrived that morning with any expectation that the day would produce footage that a network would spend years suppressing. The investigation moved into the target area in the mid-morning. Initial readings in the zone were consistent with what the sonar data had suggested. Elevated electromagnetic variance, anomalous acoustic properties in the underground passages consistent with the presence of large void spaces beyond the accessible section of the system, and the characteristic equipment behavior that the crew had come to associate with proximity to the most active areas of the ranch. None of that was new. All of it was documentable within the established format of the show. The cameras were running continuously across multiple angles as the investigation advanced into the passage system. Standard protocol for a production production of this type involves redundant recording across independent units precisely because equipment failure in active zones of the ranch was a documented operational reality. On this particular day, that redundancy became significant because the primary camera unit operating in the forward position of the investigation did experience a failure at a specific point in the sequence of events that the banned episode documents. The secondary unit kept rolling. What it captured in the interval between the primary unit's failure and the moment the investigation team made the decision to pull back and surface is the core of what the banned episode contains. The geological consultant present that day has never given a public interview about what he witnessed. The crew members who were in the passage at the time have described the experience in terms that are consistent across independent accounts, but that none of them have been willing to put on record with any specificity. What is documented in the secondary camera footage from that morning is a sequence of events lasting approximately 11 minutes that the production team, the network executives who reviewed it, and every outside party who has since seen the surviving copy of that footage have been unable to account for within any conventional framework. The day ended early. The equipment was packed without the standard post-shoot review process. The crew left the property without the debrief session that was standard procedure at the end of every filming day. And the footage went into the editing system, where the people whose job it was to turn raw material into television watched it back and understood immediately that their job that day was going to be something else entirely. The secondary camera unit that kept rolling in the underground passage that morning captured 11 minutes of footage that begins with a standard documentary investigation sequence and ends somewhere that no one on that crew had a category for. The first several minutes are unremarkable by the standards of what the show had already broadcast. The passage interior, the equipment readings climbing as the team advanced, the geological consultant moving his instruments along the wall surface and calling out numbers that the audio picked up clearly. The electromagnetic variance in that section of the underground system was running higher than anything previously recorded on the property, and the consultant's tone in those early minutes carries the particular quality of a trained professional working hard to stay analytical in conditions that are pushing against that discipline. Then the passage changed. Not collapsed, not flooded, not blocked by any physical obstruction the team encountered. The passage changed in a way that the camera documents, but that no geological process in the literature accounts for. The wall surface in the forward section of the passage, which the camera had been recording continuously, registered a shift in its physical properties that the footage captures in real time. The texture visible on the treated stone surface altered. The consultant stopped calling out numbers. The audio from that point forward carries a quality of silence that is different from the ambient underground quiet of the earlier footage. A silence that the crew members present have described in their independent accounts as the absence of something that had been present the entire time without anyone consciously registering it until it was gone. At the 4-minute and 30-second mark of the relevant sequence, something became visible at the far end of the passage. The secondary camera's low light capability was sufficient to capture it, though the resolution at that distance leaves aspects of what is visible open to interpretation. What is not open to interpretation is that it is there, that it is present for an uninterrupted duration of approximately 90 seconds before the footage cuts to the surface exterior of the ranch, and that every person who has reviewed that 90-second sequence has described what is visible in terms that are consistent with each other and inconsistent with any conventional explanation for what could physically exist in that location. The crew did not advance toward it. The decision to pull back was made without verbal communication according to the accounts of those present. A collective and simultaneous understanding that the investigation had reached a boundary that morning that it was not equipped to cross. What is visible in those 90 seconds is what the network reviewed and determined could not be broadcast. It is what the geological consultant has refused to discuss publicly, and it is what the surviving copy of the banned episode preserves in full. The footage from that morning was transferred to the editing system the same day it was shot, which was standard procedure for the production. What was not standard was the sequence of events that followed the first playback. The editor who reviewed the raw transfer that evening has described the experience in terms that have been consistent across every account they have given. A gradual escalation of unease during the standard footage review that reached a specific and decisive point at the beginning of the 11-minute sequence. followed by an immediate decision to escalate to the senior producer rather than continue the review alone. The senior producer watched the sequence the same evening. By the following morning, the footage had been escalated to the executive level of the production company without going through the normal editorial pipeline. That acceleration of the chain of review is itself significant. Standard documentary production operates on a timeline in which raw footage moves through multiple editorial stages before anyone at the executive level sees it. The fact that this sequence moved from raw transfer to executive review in under 24 hours indicates that everyone who saw it at each stage of that escalation understood immediately that it was not something that could be handled within the normal parameters of the production process. The executive viewing took place in a closed session with a limited number of people present. Accounts of that session describe a room that went very quiet during the 11-minute sequence and stayed quiet for an extended period afterward. The discussion that followed was not, according to those present, a debate about whether the footage could be broadcast. The question of broadcast was settled in the room before anyone said it out loud. The discussion was about what to do with footage that could not be unseen by the people who had already seen it and could not be allowed to be seen by the people who had not. The decision to pull the episode was communicated to the network the same day. The network's response, according to sources familiar with the exchange, was not surprise. It was relief. That response, relief rather than resistance, agreement rather than pushback from a network that had a financial interest in every episode it had commissioned, is one of the most telling details in the entire story of how this episode disappeared. Networks do not easily walk away from produced content they have paid for. The speed and unanimity with which everyone in the chain agreed that this episode needed to disappear suggests that the footage had done something to everyone who watched it that made the financial consideration feel entirely beside the point. The official account of why the banned Blind Frog Ranch episode never aired is that it does not exist, because the official position of everyone involved in the production and broadcast chain has been to deny that the episode exists at all. There has been no network statement, no production company acknowledgement, no on-record comment from any crew member, consultant, or executive who was part of the process that resulted in the episode being pulled. That total absence of official acknowledgement is itself a form of information. Productions cancel episodes for all kinds of reasons: legal disputes, consent issues, content that becomes inappropriate in light of subsequent real-world events. When an episode is pulled for any of those conventional reasons, the fact of its existence is generally acknowledged, even if the specific reason is not disclosed. The complete denial of the episode's existence indicates that the people managing the suppression understood that acknowledging the episode had been made would immediately invite questions about why it had been buried that they were not prepared to answer. What the evidence does allow for is a reconstruction of the decision-making chain based on the timeline of events, the speed of the suppression process, and the accounts of people who were present at various points without being the final decision makers. The production company made the initial call to escalate. The network agreed to suppress without resistance. What happened between those two events, what conversations took place, who else was contacted, and whether any party outside the normal production-broadcast relationship was involved in the decision, is where the documented record becomes incomplete in ways that are themselves revealing. The speed of the suppression is the most significant indicator that the decision did not originate entirely within the commercial television structure. Production companies and networks operate on timelines driven by contractual obligations, broadcast schedules, and financial considerations that do not typically allow for rapid, unilateral decisions to destroy the value of a completed episode. The decision to pull this episode was made and implemented faster than the normal operational rhythm of the organizations involved would allow for if it had been purely an internal call. Something accelerated that process. Whether that acceleration came from a government agency with a documented interest in the Uinta Basin, from a private party with a stake in managing what is publicly known about Blind Frog Ranch and the broader phenomenon of the region, or from something else entirely, is a question the surviving footage does not answer directly. What it does answer is the question of whether the decision was made because of what was in the footage. On that question, everyone who has seen the 11-minute sequence is in complete agreement. The banning of this Blind Frog Ranch episode does not exist in isolation. It fits inside a pattern of paranormal and UAP-adjacent content being suppressed, modified, or quietly buried that stretches back decades and involves organizations operating well above the level of cable television networks. The history of government interest in the Uinta Basin specifically is not speculative. It is documented. The AAWSAP program, The Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Initiative that ran from 2007 through 2012 designated Skinwalker Ranch as a primary research site and directed significant classified resources toward understanding the phenomenon concentrated in this stretch of northeastern Utah. That program's interest did not end when its funding was officially discontinued. What AAWSAP produced was a body of findings that the government has never fully declassified, covering a region that includes Blind Frog Ranch within its documented radius of anomalous activity. The pattern of media suppression around this region follows the same geography. Productions that have gotten too close to specific categories of evidence in the Uinta Basin have encountered interference that does not originate from network executives making editorial judgments. Crew members on multiple productions operating in this area have described being approached by individuals who did not identify their institutional affiliation, but whose interest in what the cameras had captured was specific, informed, and applied with a pressure that went beyond any normal network or legal process. The banned Blind Frog Ranch episode surfaced despite that pressure. That fact alone tells you that whatever system has been managing the information environment around this region is not as complete as the people running it would prefer. The survival of the banned episode footage is a story about one person who decided that the suppression was wrong and acted on that decision at significant personal risk. The copy that has surfaced was not leaked carelessly or distributed widely before its contents could be verified. It was preserved deliberately, held for an extended period while the person in possession of it determined that the appropriate moment to release it had arrived, and transferred through a chain of custody that prioritized verification of its authenticity over speed of distribution. The footage is a direct copy of the raw transfer from the secondary camera unit that was running in the underground passage that morning. It has not been edited. The 11-minute sequence is intact. The metadata embedded in the file is consistent with the production timeline of the show and has been examined by 2 independent digital forensics analysts whose findings confirm that the footage has not been altered or composited after the fact. What that verification establishes is that the footage is exactly what it appears to be: unedited raw camera output from a professional documentary production, capturing in real time a sequence of events that the people present that morning have never been willing to describe publicly, and that the organizations responsible for the show have spent years pretending does not exist. The source who preserved and released this footage has not made themselves publicly known. What they have said through the intermediary who facilitated the release is that they held it as long as they did because they needed to be certain the world was ready. They decided it was. Everything the broadcast version of Blind Frog Ranch presented to its audience was cleared. Every anomaly, every strange reading, every underground discovery that made it to television passed through a review process that determined it was something the public could be shown. The banned episode failed that review not because it was less credible than what aired, but because it was more final. The broadcast episodes asked questions. The banned episode answered one. And the answer visible in that 90-second sequence in the underground passage is not one that fits inside any framework the modern world is currently operating with. The infrastructure of how human beings understand their history, their planet, and their place within it does not have a category for what that footage documents. That is why it was buried. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it was undeniable. Every investigation that has ever been conducted on Blind Frog Ranch, every anomaly cataloged, every artifact recovered, every reading that defied the geological models, all of it was pointing toward the thing the banned episode put on camera. Duane Ollinger spent years and a fortune and a significant portion of his health pursuing something beneath his property that everyone around him insisted was not there. The banned episode is the record of the moment the property confirmed he was right. It has been hidden for years. It has now surfaced. And the question it leaves behind is not what is underneath Blind Frog Ranch. That question has been answered. The question now is what we are going to do with the answer. What you're about to hear changes everything about Blind Frog Ranch. 9 craft, silent, hovering in perfect formation above the Utah desert. This wasn't a random sighting. This was a response. It started with 2 drill holes hitting a layer of strangely blue material at depth. That night, warnings came in. Claims of a blue aura across the mountainside. Urgent messages saying they'd stirred up attention, that it was dangerous, but they didn't listen. They drove back towards the ranch. Their truck started ticking like a bomb timer. Even after being ordered to pull over, they continued forward. Then the sky filled with craft. 3 objects rose and parked in place, surrounded by mist, completely silent. Then 3 more, then 3 more, 9 total, aligned in single file, hovering with impossible precision. No engine noise, no propulsion. Subscribe now, because what happened that night suggests something beneath Blind Frog Ranch is actively monitored and willing to respond when boundaries are crossed. Blind Frog Ranch didn't start as a paranormal investigation. It started as a practical project, a group of people working the land, exploring old mining claims, trying to understand the property's history and potential. But somewhere along the way, the work shifted. Strange things kept happening. Equipment behaved oddly. Certain areas of the ranch seemed to produce consistent anomalies. Normal planning started breaking down because outcomes didn't match the effort being put in. The team brought in serious help, not ghost hunters or paranormal enthusiasts, but people with specialized knowledge, contacts who understood scanning methods, ways to identify target points beneath the surface, techniques for mapping underground structures. The belief emerged, based on data and repeated observations, that the land has hotspots, specific locations where something unusual is either buried or occurs with regularity. These weren't random guesses. Ground-penetrating radar suggested anomalies at depth. Electromagnetic readings showed variations in specific zones. Historical accounts from previous property owners mentioned strange lights, unusual sounds, areas where animals refused to go. The ranch began to reveal itself as a place with patterns, with rules that didn't match conventional understanding of how land, geology, and physics should behave. Over time, the team developed a working theory. Blind Frog Ranch sits on something, whether it's geological, technological, or something else entirely. There's something beneath the property that affects what happens on the surface. And the key to understanding it might be accessing whatever is buried at depth. That's why they started drilling. That's why they targeted specific points identified through scanning and analysis. They weren't digging randomly, they were following data. But here's what makes Blind Frog Ranch different from other properties with unusual histories. It's not just that strange things happen, it's that the ranch seems to respond to investigation. When you dig in certain areas, things escalate. When you use certain equipment, phenomena intensify. It's as if the property is reactive, as if there's something monitoring what's being done and choosing how to react. And the Night of the Nine Craft proved that theory in the most dramatic way possible, because the Night of the Nine Craft didn't start with the sky. It started with dirt, blue dirt. And what that dirt represented changed everything about how the team understood what they were dealing with. The instruction was specific. Drill 2 deep points on the east side of the property, specific depths, specific spacing. The precision of the directive suggested that whoever provided the information already knew what was down there. This wasn't exploratory drilling. This was targeted excavation based on data that indicated something unusual at depth in that exact location. The drilling operation began with standard procedures, modern equipment, experienced operators, careful documentation of what they encountered at each depth. For the first portion of the drilling, they hit expected geology, soil, rock, layers that made sense for the region. Then, at significant depth, the drill bit encountered something different. Material that came up blue, not slightly discolored, not mineral staining, blue, a color that shouldn't exist in natural subsurface soil at that location. The team examined the material as it came to the surface. It wasn't just colored differently, it had unusual properties. The texture was wrong. The consistency didn't match surrounding geology. It appeared more like a manufactured layer than a natural geological formation. Some described it as looking like an insulator, a barrier, something placed rather than something that formed naturally over geological time. Then came the detail that eliminated any possibility of coincidence. They moved to the second drill point, separated from the first by specific measured distance. Different location, different angle of approach, but targeting the same approximate depth. And when they reached that depth, they hit the same blue material. Not similar material, the same material, as if a continuous sheet or layer ran through the mountain, and both drill points had penetrated it. Think about what that means. Natural geological layers can extend over areas, but they vary in depth, thickness, composition. They're not perfectly consistent across distances, but this material appeared at the same depth in both holes, with the same property, the same coloration, the same unusual characteristics. It behaved like a manufactured structure, like something that had been placed underground with specific dimensions and specific purpose. The team documented everything. Samples were collected, depths were recorded, photographs were taken, but even as they worked, there was a growing sense that they had crossed a threshold, that the drilling hadn't just uncovered something buried. According to what they would be told next, the drilling had released something, or alerted something, or broken through a barrier that had been keeping something contained, and the response was about to begin. That night, after the drilling was complete, after the equipment had been shut down and the team had left the drill sites, the message came in. A contact, someone connected to the specialized help that had been brought in to analyze the property, called with urgent information. They claimed to be seeing something unusual on their monitoring systems, a blue aura stretching across the mountainside, short lightning-like discharges appearing around the area where the drilling had occurred. This is where the tone of the entire operation changed. Up until this point, the work at Blind Frog Ranch had been methodical, careful, driven by curiosity and data, but the warning call transformed curiosity into consequence. Whatever they had done by drilling through that blue layer had triggered a response, and that response was being detected by monitoring systems that shouldn't have been picking up anything from a simple drilling operation. The warning intensified. Do not go out there. It's dangerous. You stirred up attention. The language was specific and urgent, not vague concern, but concrete warning based on observable phenomena. Whoever was on that call believed that the drilling had activated something, awakened something, or attracted the attention of something that was now focused on the property. The team faced a decision. They could accept the warning and stay away, or they could go verify what they were being told. These weren't people prone to accepting stories without evidence. They had worked too hard, invested too much time and resources, encountered too many anomalies that turned out to be real. They needed to see for themselves what was happening at the ranch. They needed to verify whether the blue aura and electrical discharges were actually occurring. So they made the choice to return, to drive back toward Blind Frog Ranch despite being told it was dangerous, despite the warning that they had stirred up attention. Because verification, seeing with their own eyes, documenting what was actually happening, that was more important than accepting a secondhand report. And that decision, that choice to return despite the warning, is what led them directly into the most extraordinary encounter of their investigation. On the drive back toward the ranch, still in communication with the contact who had warned them not to return, something changed. The vehicle began making a sound, not a normal mechanical sound, not an engine knock or a suspension rattle or any of the familiar noises that vehicles make. This was different, unnatural. Those in the truck described it as ticking, like a bomb timer, regular, rhythmic, completely wrong. The sound was loud enough that the person on the phone could hear it through the call, and their reaction was immediate and intense. Pull over, get out of the vehicle, now. The urgency in their voice left no room for discussion. Whatever was causing that ticking sound, it represented a genuine threat, not a mechanical problem that could wait, not something to investigate later, an immediate danger that required them to exit the vehicle. This becomes a pivotal tension moment in the story. These are tough people, experienced, not easily frightened. They've dealt with equipment failures, dangerous situations, high-risk work, but something about that ticking sound, combined with the urgency of the warning, triggered genuine fear, practical fear, the kind of fear that comes from recognizing that you're in a situation you don't understand and that continuing forward could have serious consequences. They pulled over, they exited the vehicle, they stood on the side of the road away from the truck while the ticking continued, and they had to make another decision. Turn back, admit that whatever was happening was beyond what they could safely investigate, or continue forward, despite the warning, despite the truck's behavior, despite every indication that they were entering a situation that had escalated beyond normal parameters. And even after they stopped, even after the warning, they still chose to keep going, because something about that night felt like it was pulling them forward, like events had been set in motion, and they needed to see them through. Like the drilling, the blue material, the warning, the ticking truck, all of it was leading towards something that demanded to be witnessed. So they got back in the vehicle, and they continued toward Blind Frog Ranch. The moon was bright that night, unusually bright. Visibility was clear in a way that made the landscape feel exposed, open, like there was nowhere to hide. The Utah desert stretched out around them, familiar terrain, that suddenly felt foreign. The land seemed to be waiting, not threatening exactly, but expectant, as if something was about to happen and the property itself knew it. They weren't heading to the drill site. They were approaching a different area of the property, a low ravine that had been identified in previous investigations as another hotpoint. According to scanning data and historical accounts, something unusual was buried there. Some claimed it might be meteorite material. Others suggested it could be connected to whatever created the patterns of anomalies across the ranch. It was another target point, another location where the property seemed to concentrate strange phenomena. The contact on the phone was still connected, still monitoring whatever systems were showing the blue aura and electrical activity. And as the team described where they were going, the contact's tone shifted. Not angry, not trying to stop them anymore, almost resigned. If you insist on going, someone will meet you. The phrasing was strange. Someone will meet you. Not something might happen. Not you might see something unusual. Someone will meet you. As if the contact knew with certainty that their arrival would trigger a response. They descended into the ravine, moving carefully in the bright moonlight, watching the ridgeline above them, scanning the sky out of habit. The quiet was absolute. No wind, no animal sounds, just the sound of their footsteps and breathing. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small noise, every movement in your peripheral vision. The kind of quiet that precedes something significant. And that's when the story stops being about the ground, about drill holes and blue material and buried anomalies. That's when it becomes about the sky. Because what happened next wasn't hidden underground or detectable only through specialized equipment. What happened next was visible, undeniable, witnessed by multiple people, and absolutely impossible to explain through conventional means. 3 objects rose over the mountain, not from ground level, not launching or ascending. They simply appeared above the ridgeline and stopped. Parked, that's the word those present used. They parked in place. No drift, no wobble, no visible movement at all. They achieved position and held it with absolute stability, like they were locked onto coordinates in 3-dimensional space. The visual signature was unlike anything they'd seen before. Each craft was surrounded by what appeared to be mist or fog, but the effect wasn't natural atmospheric condensation. It was more like a cloud shell that formed around each object after it stopped moving, as if the act of hovering created some kind of field effect that became visible in the air around them. The mist seemed to cling to the craft, moving with them when they repositioned, dissipating and reforming. They were close enough to estimate scale, close enough to judge spacing, close enough that there was no question about what they were looking at. These weren't distant lights that could be misidentified as planes or satellites. These were solid objects with defined shapes, hovering at relatively low altitude, visible in detail against the night sky. And what terrified everyone watching was the silence. Complete, absolute silence. No engine noise, no propulsion sound, nothing. Aircraft make noise. Helicopters are deafening. Jets create distinct sounds. Even drones produce audible buzzing. But these craft made no sound at all, and they were close enough that any conventional propulsion system would have been clearly audible. The silence was almost more disturbing than the sight of the objects themselves, because silence meant these things weren't operating according to any known principles of flight. The team stood frozen, watching 3 silent craft hover above them. Part of their brains tried to find rational explanations. Secret military technology, some kind of advanced drone system, anything that would fit into a framework they could understand. But another part of them, the part that had been working this ranch for months, that had encountered anomaly after anomaly, that part knew they were seeing something that shouldn't exist. And then it happened again, because 3 wasn't the point. The point was the pattern. 3 more craft appeared, rising over the same ridgeline, achieving the same hovering position, forming the same mist-like effect around their shapes. They aligned with the first 3, extending the formation. Then 3 more, 9 total, all silent, all hovering with impossible stability, all aligned in single file across the scene like someone had plotted coordinates and positioned them with mathematical precision. The physics-breaking nature of what they were witnessing became overwhelming. 9 craft maintaining perfect hovering position, no drift, no adjustment, no visible means of propulsion. Formation precision that would be challenging for trained pilots in conventional aircraft, but these objects were holding position without any apparent effort, without any visible control surfaces, without any of the behaviors you'd expect from flying machines. No engine noise, no wind wash, no disturbance of the air beneath them. When helicopters hover, you feel the rotor wash, you hear the turbines, you see dust and debris kicked up by the down onwash. These craft produced none of that. They hung in the sky like they had been painted there, like they were exempt from the normal rules of mass, gravity, and propulsion. The absence of normal aircraft characteristics was as striking as their presence. Human reaction to the impossible is complex. One person in the group was locked in awe, unable to look away, trying to memorize every detail because some part of them knew they might never see anything like this again. Others were visibly shaken, their brains struggling to process what their eyes were reporting, fighting against the cognitive dissonance of seeing something that couldn't be real but undeniably was. Because the brain has frameworks for processing flying objects, planes, helicopters, drones, birds, even experimental aircraft. But these craft didn't fit any of those frameworks. They were too stable, too silent, too precisely positioned. They violated too many expectations about how objects move through air, how they maintain position, how they should behave according to known physics. And when your brain can't file what you're seeing into any existing category, the result is a kind of existential shock. And if 9 craft show up and just wait, if they achieve formation and hold position without any apparent purpose other than being visible, the question becomes terrifying. Who were they waiting for? What were they monitoring? Were they observing the team? Were they protecting something? Were they demonstrating capability? And perhaps most disturbing, how long had they been watching before they decided to reveal themselves? After the event, after the 9 craft eventually departed, after the team returned from the ravine shaken and trying to process what they had witnessed, the directive became clear. Remove the equipment, cover the drill points, step away from those areas. The message wasn't subtle. They had crossed a boundary. They had penetrated something they shouldn't have accessed. And the response, the 9 craft appearing in formation, was a warning, a demonstration, a statement that whatever they were investigating was aware of their presence and capable of responding. The equipment was removed from the drill sites. The holes were covered, secured, marked with warnings about stability and safety. But everyone involved knew those weren't the real reasons for shutting it down. The real reason was fear, not irrational panic, but practical recognition that they had encountered something far beyond their ability to understand or control, something that had demonstrated it was watching, that it could respond, and that it had capabilities that defied known technology. The eerie takeaway from the entire incident wasn't just what they saw, it was what it implied. The holes stayed buried for years after that night. The story was carried quietly, shared only with people who had clearance or involvement in the investigation. The team didn't immediately go public with what happened. They processed it privately, tried to understand it, debated what it meant for their work at the ranch. Because the fear wasn't really about the 9 craft themselves. The fear was about the larger pattern they represented. Blind Frog Ranch behaves like it has rules, invisible boundaries that you can't see until you cross them. And when those rules are broken, when those boundaries are violated, the ranch triggers a response. Not random, not coincidental. A deliberate, proportional response that seems designed to warn, to intimidate, or to prevent further investigation. The drilling penetrated a blue layer at depth. Warnings came in about blue auras and electrical activity. The truck exhibited strange behavior. 9 craft appeared in formation. Every step followed logically from the one before, as if the entire sequence was a programmed response to the act of drilling through that barrier. Like the ranch, or something connected to the ranch, was following a protocol, and that protocol included making very clear that certain areas should not be disturbed. But there's one more twist to this story. Because the sky event, as dramatic and impossible as it was, wasn't the end of the strange occurrences at Blind Frog Ranch. It was the beginning of a longer, stranger trail. A trail that would include more anomalies, more unexplained phenomena, more evidence that whatever is buried beneath that property is far more complex than anyone initially suspected. The 9 craft appeared after drilling through the blue layer, after the warnings, exactly when the team returned. The timing was precise, like an intervention. Were they watching the entire time? Something knew when the boundary was crossed. Was the blue layer a seal? It appeared at the same depth in both holes and triggered immediate response. Why formation and silence? If they wanted to hide, they could have. Instead, they appeared and waited. A clear message. We are here. We are aware. We are capable. The ticking truck. The blue aura. 9 craft in perfect formation. The ranch didn't call them. The ranch alerted them. Like a security system triggering an alarm. Something beneath Blind Frog Ranch is monitored, protected, and responds when boundaries are crossed.